Hey guys, TheKamsh here. As many of you know, Blackrock Mountain was just released as the new adventure expansion, kind of like Nax was, which is really awesome news. The game's going to change quite a bit. It's going to be released sometime next month, but we've been able to see 5 cards from it so far, and I'm going to be talking about those today and some of their constructed and arena potentials, as well as generally just the mechanics. So let's jump right in here. First, we have Dark Iron Skulker. This is a really cool effect. It's like a mass backstab stapled onto a creature. It's a rogue class minion, which makes sense because it's a very rogue-like effect. So, to talk about the card's constructed potential, it is a little bit redundant in Rogue just because Rogue does have a lot of AoE and a lot of clear, especially the current Rogue kind of decks, where they really want their creatures to be sticky and try to stay on the board. And they have a lot of spells for AoE like Blade Flurry and Phantom Knives. And this costs 5, so it's kind of hard to do a huge AoE combo with this plus like Blade Flurry because this does cost quite a bit of mana, so you'd have to empty out your hand and have this in your hand with a lot of other AoE. So it is slightly redundant in the Rogue deck. That is currently the oiled rogue deck that is currently being played quite a bit on ladder. But this is a very good card, and I definitely think it could see it play in that deck. It just doesn't really help the hard matchups. It just makes the mech mage and sort of the easier aggro rush matchups easier. So I definitely think this could see play in that deck, but this is a lot better suited to like a tempo or mid-range rogue. If that ends up developing after this expansion, I think this could be very good in that deck as well. But I think that this card could definitely see constructed play. As far as arena goes, this is like half a flame strike stapled to a 4/3, and that's very good. So I definitely think this is a pretty high pick in arena. So overall, I give this card about a 7 out of 10, and I think the mechanic's very cool. So moving on, we have Grim Patron. Now, just to start off clarifying, we don't have a ton of clarification on how this card works, but as far as I'm aware, the ability animation resolves before the effect of cards like this. So for example, if you play a Balancing Blade with like some Armor Smiths and an Acolyte of Pain out, it's going to bounce around, all the animations will happen, it'll kill something, then after it's gone you'll see it'll take like a minute for all your Armor Smiths to trigger. So I think this card works the same. So if you like Bouncing Blade and it hits this twice, it's not going to make 2 more guys for Grim Patrons for it to hit. It's just going to stay there, and then once the Bouncing Blade finishes resolving, it'll make the 2 guys if it got hit twice. But it is theoretically possible that this does make the copies before the ability animation resolves, so this could just like make 5 dudes if it's hit by Matter Bomber or something along those lines. But I believe it can only make 2 per spell or damaging ability. So, whatever the case is, this is sort of like a neutral Quartermaster combo. It takes more resources, except it's worse because this costs 5, and then you have to additionally pay for whatever you're using to trigger it. The 5 mana really hurts. 5 mana is a lot for just a 3/3 or multiple 3/3s. It's really bad against AoE, like Flame Strike, or Spell-Powered Blade Flurry, or Blade Flurry with a large weapon, or double Spell-Power Phantom Knives. Just in general, it's pretty bad against AoE. It's most easily activated by Warrior or Mage, but the current Warrior deck, like Control Warrior, doesn't really want this, and Combo Warrior doesn't really want this either, like the Frothing Berserker Warrior, because this costs 5 and just makes a lot of 3/3s. Like the Mage Lock deck with Duplicate, Echo of Medivh, things like that, might want this because you can ping it, copy it, Echo or something, and you just have a never-ending stream of 3/3s, but that's not something you necessarily want. 3/3 just isn't a great place to be. As far as arena goes, this is a more expensive Raging Worgen with a little bit of a higher payoff, because if you play Raging Worgen, they can't remove it, but they have a small creature. You can bump this into their creature. You can bump Worgen to their creature and then give it Wind Fury, or you can bump this into their creature and then make it a copy of it. But that doesn't seem that great just because this card costs 5 mana, so by the time your opponents have 5 mana, they probably won't have a smaller creature for you to bump against. They'll probably just be able to kill this, and it's just going to be a 5 mana 3/3. It is pretty good in arena with Mage, just because you can ping it and make more 3/3s, but that's 7 mana for 2 3/3s and the possibility of more 3/3s, which isn't necessarily great. Just the fact that the combination of 5 mana with the 3/3 is kind of meh. So I'll give this a 5 out of 10, just because it could, in theory, have some combo potential or something, but I don't think this card's super great, although it is really cool. Moving on, we have Hungry Dragon. So let me just start off by saying, if there is a lot of really cool dragon synergy in this set, this card's going to be pretty good just because it's a decent dragon. But let's just talk about the card for now as if we don't know about any of the dragon synergy, because we really don't. So the stats of the guy it makes, and it presumably makes the guy because it's hungry and wants to eat it. I did a little bit of math. The average attack is going to be around 1.4 or 1.35. The average health on the thing it makes is going to be around 1.65. There's a 9% chance to get a taunt, and there is a 6% chance to get a creature that replaces itself. So like Clockwork Gnome or Web Spinner would be the two that just generate card advantage for your opponent. The worst case scenario is usually going to be your opponent gets a Dust Devil or a Flame Imp, although Northshire Cleric could be the worst case scenario if you're going against a Priest. A Leper Gnome could be the worst case scenario if you have a lot of taunts but you're a low life total. So if this guy eats a removal spell, he's pretty bad because you're giving your opponent a 1-for-1, they get something left over. So you're giving your opponent a 2-for-1 basically. So this could get Shadow or Death, Fireballed, a lot of things like that, Executed, Shield Slammed. And while it does make your opponent use removal on something small, or something small costed rather, 4 mana, it does leave them behind with a guy, and this just sort of dies. So it's not great against removal. It could give a minion to your opponent that they need, like we've already talked about, which is pretty bad. It's really bad against Rogue because it just gets sapped. Or against like Oil Rogue, you give them a creature and they just oil it up and kill you. It's pretty bad against an aggressive class because they can just ignore it, especially like Hunter. If they play Freezing Trap, this card's really awful because it just gives them a creature they can attack with and they get to sort of ignore it. So we have to think about what deck really wants this card. Possibly like Druid as sort of a better Yeti, although it's not necessarily better. Or maybe like a mid-range deck, maybe Zoo. But then we have to ask ourselves, is this card really better than Piloted Shredder? I'd probably say no, because a lot of the time, Piloted Shredder plus whatever this makes will be able to trade with this card, maybe with another creature or something along those lines, and then the Shredder leaves them behind with something. So this is like a reverse Piloted Shredder with better stats, but I think Shredder still ends up being better in a lot of decks, especially since if this dies, it doesn't leave anything behind except for your opponent, versus if you have a Shredder and you're trying to Savage Roar your opponent for lethal, if they kill the Shredder, you still get a creature left over you can pump. So I think Shredder is going to be better than this in a lot of cases, unless there's some strong dragon synergy. As far as Arena goes, even the worst case when you gave them a 3-power minion, this is still going to be a 5/3 for 4, which is fine in Arena. It's a big guy most of the time, so I think in Arena it'll be fine. So without dragon synergy, I'd probably give this card a 5 out of 10. It has some potential, but it's probably worse than some existing 4-drops already. With like a lot of strong dragon synergy, I think this card can go up to a 6 out of 10 because it is a tribal card that is pretty solid. So moving on, we have Blackwing Technician. So let's just start about talking about the holding dragons mechanic before we evaluate this card in general, because it is a mechanic that will be on multiple cards in the set. So people seem to think that the only relevant dragons so far are like Azure Drake, Fairy Dragon, and Twilight Drake for this mechanic, but I'd have to disagree. It's important to remember that if you're holding a dragon mechanic is about whether you have one in your hand or not about whether you control one. So if you have like Fairy Dragon in your hand, you're probably going to want to play it on turn 2, and if not, you're just leaving a 2-drop in your hand for a long time to enable this, and by the time you actually play the Fairy Dragon after you've used all your holding cards, it's going to be pretty awful. Versus cards like Ysera or Alexstrasza, which already see extensive constructed play, those are cards you want to hold in your hand, or rather you have to because you can't cast them early. So those are cards that work great with holding because they just stay in your hand, enable holding, and then they're a late game bomb afterwards. So I think things like Ysera or Alexstrasza are actually more applicable with holding than things like Fairy Dragon, but we'll have to see what other dragons get printed and things like that. Just as far as this card goes, it's a 3/5 for 3 if you have lots of dragons, which is pretty good, but also you're doing a lot of work for a slightly better spider tank. Then again, the difference between 5 and 4 is pretty big because 4 health minions are killed a lot more easily by smaller minions or weapons and things of that sort, whereas 5 health is a lot harder to deal with. And Blizzard, it's important to remember that Blizzard has a really good track record of supporting tribal. Mechs are competitive. Murlocs were at one point competitive way back in the day before Nax. Beasts Hunters were competitive and still sometimes are. Death Rattles were very good before Undertaker nerfs. Pirates is the only the black mark on their record of supporting tribal. But I think they're going to try their best to support the dragon holding mechanic and sort of dragon decks. So I think it's a pretty safe bet that there will be a lot of cards printed to support this, and that you'll be able to make it 3/5 for 3 a decent amount of the time, so I think it's a pretty good card. Likely goes in some sort of mid-range dragons deck with like larger dragons as your finishers, then things with holding and sort of things that gain you advantage because of your dragons in the mid to early game. So in Arena, this card's significantly worse just because you don't know how many dragons you'll be able to draft, and a lot of the time it'll be a 3-mana 2/4, although if you get a good draft it could be bigger. So not too great in Arena, but reasonable. I'm going to give this card overall 5 out of 10, but if there's lots of great dragon synergy, and if the dragon deck is like clearly has a lot of payoff and it's worth playing, I think this card jumps up to a 6 out of 10. So finally, let's talk about the legendary we have spoiled, Reynad Blackhand. So just for a moment, let's pretend this card doesn't say holding dragons and evaluate that way. The statistics are a little bit hard on this just because there's a variety of skill levels on ladder, and there's a lot of people that don't report their stats. But it looks like the average amount of legendaries run in a ladder deck is 3.6. Some of the aggressive decks bring this down, whereas Warrior brings this up. But as for this card, that number effectively decreases because you don't really want to be killing like Blood Mage Thalnos with this because that's just awful value. Any legendaries with 7+ attack, you'd rather be killing with BGH than a much more conditional card that costs 7. This card isn't effective at killing Sylvanas because it just steals something or gets this. So what do you really want to use this on? Like Lotheb? It's an 8/4, so it dies to pretty much everything. So it ends up being like a very conditional BGH, slightly harder to kill, a little bit more upside if it stays alive a turn, but it also costs 7 and won't always have targets. If you don't have a dragon in your hand, it does nothing, and has worse stats than a core hound for the same cost. Also, it's important to think, how often are you going to have a dragon in your hand by turn 7+, while your opponent has a legendary in play, and you have to deal with it, and you want to use all your mana on this to play something with 4 health that isn't BGH range, rather than like playing a BGH and developing a 4-drop. It's also important to note that this does not say enemy minion, so if you control a legendary and have a dragon in your hand, this card is unplayable because it will kill your own legendary. It doesn't kill itself because it's a battle cry, which is kind of unfortunate because that's probably the best use for this card. In Arena, it's just a worse core hound, and like the most value you're ever going to get out of this is killing Ysera, which is sort of the dream, but other than that, card is pretty awful, so I'd probably give it around a 2 out of 10. So that is all the cards we have seen so far. I'll be reviewing others as they come out. And as always, thank you for watching. This set's going to be really cool, and I'm really excited for it. Thanks, guys.